I left it off at the end of the last class with the question whether or not there's such a sharp distinction between classical political philosophy and modern political philosophy. I've been arguing that there is a very considerable distinction between the two, and that the Declaration reflected modern political philosophy, and I contrasted classical political philosophy in order to get a sense for how different American government was. I think there's a great deal of truth in that depiction of a sharp contrast between modern and classical political philosophy. But now I want to blur the lines a bit, because it may not be quite as sharp as it might have appeared at certain moments in my presentation. For example, let's start with the classical political philosophical perspective. It's true that classical political philosophy was oriented toward the high things of human life, toward the pursuit of human excellence, at least as a theoretical goal. But that doesn't mean that classical political philosophers were unaware of the realities of power, the limits of human nature. They were certainly aware of that. Aristotle describes perhaps what we would call the best regime. He has certain ideas about what would be the very best form of government. I don't think he thought that that was an actually achievable ideal, that you could actually get that in the real world. In some ways, it was a kind of theoretical construct that provided guidance to what we do. And what we do in the real world is always qualified by our limitations, by our defects. Now, it's certainly true still that Aristotle took his orientation from the question of human excellence and how to promote human excellence. But being very well aware of the defects of human beings, that not all the people in government are going to pursue real human excellence, that there's a lot of selfishness, vice, evil in the world. Aristotle also had a concern for certain kinds of limitations. So, for example, I think the best practicable form of government, rather than a kind of purely theoretical form of government for Aristotle, would have been something that we'd call mixed government. Aristotle was aware that each form of government, let's say monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, they all had certain kinds of characteristic defects as tendencies to go off in a certain direction, and that they had to be somehow limited or checked. And one way to do that was to try to have a blending of forms of government, what we call mixed government, so that the characteristic defects of each form might be offset by some of the benefits of the other. And so, yes, classical political philosophy was oriented toward human excellence, and it's very distinctive and different from the modern approach. But at the same time, you can also recognize there was a certain recognition of the limits of human affairs in Aristotle as well. And so that may limit the difference, the gap between classical and modern political philosophy somewhat. Now, on the other hand, let's turn to modern political philosophy. Here I've talked about a form of government that focuses especially on protecting rights, natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And there was a certain reluctance, or something stronger than that, I think, an opposition to the idea of making human excellence the goal of political life. The reason being that if you focus on human excellence, you get very different ideas about what constitutes human excellence, what's the best way of life. And modern thinkers like Locke and Hobbes before him were concerned about the kind of fighting and the disruption of society, the loss of peace and many other temporal goods that would result if you were so intent on getting society to pursue some particular form of human excellence or the best way of living. And so the modern approach to politics backed off those very high questions of human excellence and focused on what people could agree on more consistently. And that's that we all want to protect our life, we want self-preservation, even comfortable self-preservation, that we need a basic kind of liberty. We can't be other people's slaves. We need a certain amount of property, resources with which to sustain ourselves. So that's modern government. But does that mean that modern government has no concern for human excellence at all, for virtue? And the answer is no, because no form of government can be entirely insensitive to the need for human virtue for the well-being of that society. Every society, for example, let's start with a simple example. Every society needs its citizens to have a modicum of courage. Societies have to fight wars. They have to protect themselves in a world that's sometimes very dangerous. And that means you have to have a citizen body that is capable of courage, capable of self-sacrifice, maybe even the ultimate sacrifice of giving one's life for one's country. And so a country that had no concern for courage, no ability to sustain courage in its citizenry, would be a country that probably wouldn't last very long. Likewise, every country needs a certain kind of moderation. It doesn't have to be a kind of asceticism that people really avoid getting involved in pursuing consumer goods and things of that sort. We're not talking about some kind of ascetical ideal. Just saying that people can't be completely absorbed in the pursuit of property, in the pursuit of comfortable well-being. Because even modern liberal democracies need to have a certain kind of moderation. Why? Well, if people are just concerned about whether they're comfortable and staying alive, first of all, go back to our first example, it's going to be difficult to have courage, to have the self-sacrifice to defend one's nation. A famous instance of this in modern political debate was Lord Patrick Devlin of England asking the question, if we had a nation of people who were simply concerned with their own pleasures and narrowly understood well-being, how would they have responded to a call to blood, toil, tears, and sweat, such as the call that Churchill put out to the British people in the early and dark years of World War II? You know, you have to have a certain moderation in order to be able to subordinate your narrow self-interest to the good of the whole society. So not only courage, but a certain kind of at least basic or at least limited form of moderation is also important. Then finally, what about justice? Can you have a nation of people that doesn't really care about justice, that is only concerned with its own good, its own pure self-interest? I don't think so. Even from the standpoint of valuing freedom, what would happen in a society where people obeyed the law only because if they disobeyed it, they were going to get thrown in jail or fined or punished in some other way? I mean, that kind of society could probably only be sustained by a constant effort of coercing people into being limited, into not violating the rights of other people. But that would lead to a kind of police state, because you'd have to have cameras everywhere. You'd have to have, police agents everywhere making sure that people were staying within the bounds. What we want to have in society is a people that, by and large, for the most part, will choose to respect other people's rights, not just because they'll be punished if they don't, but because they see it as a good thing, because they see it as a part of justice. And so if you have a society that promotes an idea of justice, especially the idea of respecting the rights of others voluntarily, not just because of coercion, well, you're talking about, the need for a certain amount of virtue. So things like courage, moderation, temperance, justice, these virtues are very important to a liberal democracy as well as to other forms of government. And so you might say, even if only for instrumental reasons, even if only because you need virtue in order to achieve a free and prosperous society, there's going to have to be some kind of focus on at least a basic kind of virtue. we may not be talking about the highest ranges of human excellence. We're talking about, decency, basic virtues. And those are important just as much in a liberal democracy as they are in other forms of government. So that's going to blur the line between classical and modern philosophy a bit from that side. Just as classical political philosophy aspires to excellence, to virtue, and yet recognizes the limits of what government can do, and is a bit careful about putting too much power into government, given human beings the way they are. Likewise, modern liberal democracies of the sort that Locke would have advocated is primarily concerned about securing rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And they're not going to aim at very high levels of human virtues, perhaps. And at the same time, there's a recognition that virtue is not a matter of indifference to society, that every society needs a certain basic set of virtues in its citizenry if it's going to be a free and prosperous society. So with that, we see that the sharp contrast is maybe blurred a bit, and that we can sometimes overstate the distinction between classical and modern political philosophy. Okay, now, one of the concerns about modern government from a classical perspective is that if you have a form of government that's focused on protecting rights, that's focused especially on securing rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, well, if you have a society that emphasizes comfortable self-preservation, what that might actually end up doing is subtly inculcating in the citizenry an attitude toward life that focuses on precisely comfortable self-preservation. What would a society look like if all of the members of the society were simply concerned with, protecting their own rights to life and liberty, if they were only concerned about comfortable self-preservation? It might not be all that attractive a society. After all, isn't there in all of us a certain yearning for a kind of nobility, for the higher aspects of human life? Well, one thing we should keep in mind is, well, yeah, there may be a tendency for modern liberal democracies to encourage a way of life that focuses on comfortable self-preservation, on, for instance, to take a phrase from modern discussions, contemporary discussions, a kind of consumerist mentality, where it's probably a kind of basic level of material well-being that becomes the focal point of many people's lives. But it doesn't have to be that way. After all, one thing that modern liberal democracy does is it protects liberty to choose a way of life. Many people may choose to live lives that don't seem particularly noble. On the other hand, we all of us have a certain freedom to choose our life, and we all of us have in us a certain kind of yearning for higher things that plays a greater role perhaps in some people's lives than others, but I think it occurs really in everybody's life. One thing I think of, for example, is that over the years, over the centuries, how many people have really dedicated themselves to their families, to the well-being of their children, not out of any kind of narrow self-interest, but because of a genuine love for their families. Well, that often involves self-sacrifice, a kind of discipline, a real struggle to serve others. And that's, often a very noble thing. And so liberal democracy doesn't compel us to live lives that are insensitive to noble aspects of human nature. In fact, modern liberal democracy gives us a lot of freedom to pursue such things. And that's one of the really attractive things about modern liberal democracy. So we shouldn't equate modern governments with only kind of low objectives. We should remind ourselves that it frees us to pursue high and noble goals as well. Now, this is one reason, I think, why throughout American history you see that religion and morality play a significant role. There's an awareness of the need for religion and morality. We've seen this already in the Declaration itself, right? We talked about the fact that the source of rights is a creator, that these are God-given rights that we have. And so that basic kind of religion or natural theology was considered by the founders to be a very important part of the foundation of American government. Washington, in his farewell address, reminds Americans that religion and morality are indispensable supports to political prosperity. And so it's not surprising that throughout our history, religion and morality have played an important role. This is reflected in an interesting modern Supreme Court case quotation. In the early 1950s, there was a case called Zorak versus Clausen, which dealt with the question of religion in public schools. And in Zorak, Justice Douglas, clearly one of the more liberal modern Supreme Court justices who tended to be more separationist, to emphasize a fairly strict separation of church and state. Douglas was the author of this striking phrase, "We are a religious people whose institutions presuppose a supreme being." Now note, it wasn't just a sociological observation about Americans, that in fact, Americans had generally been religious believers throughout the course of American history. I mean, that's true as a sociological fact, but Douglas's argument went farther. It said that our institutions presuppose a supreme being. What was he talking about? How do our institutions presuppose a supreme being? Well, I think it goes back to the Declaration, back to the idea that our institutions are set up precisely to provide the protection of natural rights, and those rights are derived from a creator. And so even in the contemporary world, where perhaps a stricter separation of church and state has been advocated by some people, there's this recognition that religion does play some significant role in public life. We'll come back to discuss this later on because it's an important question in modern American government. Another factor we might want to look at is the question of morality. If you focus exclusively on the Constitution, there doesn't appear to be a whole lot of discussion of morality there. But a very important factor to keep in mind is that the American Constitution, small c, that is, if you're actually looking at the whole of American government, is more than just the American Constitution, capital C. What does the American Constitution, capital C, do? It establishes a national government, establishes a structure of government, distributes powers, says something about the relationship of that new government to state governments. But what it doesn't really do is describe state and local governments. And many of the powers of government are left to state and local governments. Now, among those, I think, are included, the classic formulation of state police power is that it deals with health, safety, welfare, and morals. That is, morality was one dimension of the state police power. And what I have in mind in particular is what you might call family morality. That is, the morality that contributes to a certain stability of family life. So that, for example, certainly throughout the founding era and for a very long time in American government, there were basic regulations of sexual morality that derive from the common law and also from positive state law as well. It involved things like prohibitions of adultery, because adultery strikes at the marriage bond. Very significant limits on divorce in order to provide stability in the family unit, which was such a valuable aspect in the life of raising children. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there was a really extensive and very close regulation of many moral issues, but there were at least some kind of basic moral ideals that were promoted at the local and state level and at the common law, as opposed to at the national level. No one expected the national government to really deal with those issues very much. But it doesn't mean that religion and morality were entirely absent from America. It meant that in the division of power, that they were primarily dealt with at the local level and state level rather than at the national level. And so there is a certain element of concern for religion and morality historically in the United States as a political community. And we shouldn't be surprised by that. It reflects the fact that every form of government, liberal democracy included, has to have at least some concern for basic morality. Finally, I guess we can leave with the question, a question we can't answer very readily perhaps right now. Does the fact that modern government focuses especially on securing rights mean that there's some kind of norm indicating that we cannot be concerned about higher things or nobler things? You know, that we can't somehow promote certain kinds of virtues. We certainly want to be careful in a society that's pluralistic, that has many different religious beliefs, many different moral beliefs, about what kinds of moral ideals we promote. Because the attempt to try to accomplish too much really does have the possibility of endangering the peace of society, because you can get into big battles over that. And this is something that modern liberal political philosophy emphasizes quite a bit, and there's a core of truth there. But we can also ask ourselves the question, does this mean that we, as a free people, as a nation, don't have any area in which we can agree on some kinds of, nobility, human excellence that we can promote and prosper, especially perhaps if we do it more indirectly rather than an attempt to command it or enforce it or coerce it? And I think that's a genuine possibility. It's something that we as a people at any given time have to work out. It's very important in any effort to promote such moral ideals that it be done with moderation and with prudence, because there is an important need to preserve peace in society, recognizing the very different ideas that many people have about what the best way of human life is. But having said that, it doesn't mean we have to just put off the table entirely, these considerations for pursuing a higher way of life. It's not going to be the major thrust of government. Major thrust of government is going to be protecting temporal goods, protecting peace, securing rights. Still, having said that, we can recognize that there are sometimes higher dimensions of political life as well, a desire to promote different kinds of virtue, intellectual virtue, to promote wisdom and prudence, moral virtues such as courage and moderation, and above all, the great political virtue of justice. So I hope I've been able to blur the line I tried to draw earlier, a line that's a very important one between classical government and the approach to government and classical political philosophy on one hand, and modern political philosophy on the other hand, which is the primary source of the Declaration and of the foundation of American government. But having established that distinction, it's also important to recognize that it's not quite so sharp as it might seem to some people, and to recall that there are many different dimensions of American government that we have to attend to. Thanks very much.